So today we're going to talk about Herbert West Reanimator by H.P. Lovecraft. This was released as a 6-part series, so in this video I'm only going to talk about part 1, From the Dark, because I highly recommend that you read these separately and not just binge read them, because they have repetition in them, because they were meant to be read as a series in subsequent episodes of a magazine, and also because he expects there to be a pause between when you read them, so that you can really think about the different issues in each one before you go on to the next one. So it helps all of that if you don't just read them all one after another, because I've read a number of reviews after I've read these a couple times with people being grumpy about the repeated nature of some of it. And the whole reason that you've got a repeated nature is because you were supposed to be reading these as a series, and you get the little recaps, like sort of when you're watching a sitcom or something. It says last week on XXX. So expect the repeats in episodes 2 to 6. And also, if you can just read them slowly and take pauses between them, I think you'll appreciate more the way that they came out originally when he was releasing them in magazines. So the claim is that H.P. Lovecraft wrote these as a response to Frankenstein. And some people say it was a parody, and I don't think that it was a parody as much as just his reimagining of the Frankenstein world in a way that made sense to him. And I have friends that feel that Frankenstein wasn't written by Mary Shelley and all sorts of other things. So there's all sorts of questions about the whole Frankenstein world in the first place. But H.P. Lovecraft clearly has his own point of view about all of this, and he was trying to write a version of Frankenstein that made more sense for him from a scientific point of view. So we've got part 1, From the Dark. So we've got Herbert West, who is the main character of this in the sense that he's the one who is mentioned all the time. But the actual main character is the narrator, and we never get to learn his name, so we'll call him narrator. This nameless person, he is, let's say, a young white college student, is pretty much all we can guess about him, knowing the way that Lovecraft is. And Herbert West is a young white college student as well. And we do get some description of him in a minute. But we start with just learning that he is a friend in college and in the life after college. And that the narrator is an extreme terror of him. And it's both about his recent disappearance, which we assume is a long way after college, because he says 17 years ago, but also from the things that he was doing in between when he first met him in his 3rd year at Miskatonic University Medical School in Arkham, and the rest of what they went through together. So the narrator has known this guy for many, many years, and we know that the guy has currently disappeared 17 years later after the college experience, but also that there were horrible things going on while he was at college and in between. And while they were together, the narrator was his closest companion, but now that the spell is broken, the actual fear is greater. There are quite a number of Lovecraft stories up until now, because I've been reading them in the order that they were published, which involve a younger, impressionable male who is completely obsessed with a slightly older male. And this again brings to mind The Rope and a number of other stories of this era, which involved that kind of a pairing. And one really has to wonder, with all of the issues that Lovecraft had between sexism and racism and so on, if he really did have some homosexual tendencies in here, that he's so obsessed with writing these kinds of stories. But maybe he just really needed a male figure in his life that he could look up to, but was also afraid of, and that he would follow wholly, loyally, even though the person was doing awful things. And at least until now, I haven't got a sense of that in Lovecraft's life from what I've read about it and written about it in the works that I've been doing. It seems that he had been with women of various sorts, but that of course doesn't say much of anything. People can do all sorts of things in their lives and then have other kinds of interests. So I just am curious to see if there would be more to all of that, and we'll see when I read forward to see if this keeps happening. So the narrator says that the first horrible incident of our acquaintance, which I can't imagine was the first one. It sounds like there's all sorts of other things going on. But also the greatest shock I ever experienced, and having read all of them now, it seems odd to me that he would call this first thing the greatest shock because there's many other shocking things which are going to come to us. But all right, he wants to lead this story off with power. So he says he's going to tell us right now about the first thing and the greatest shock thing that could possibly have happened, and that he's reluctant to repeat it. So they're in a medical school. His friend Herbert West is loving to do operations on rabbits, guinea pigs, cats, dogs, and monkeys, becoming the prime nuisance of the college, and his purpose and point is to have the creature die and then try to reanimate it. And we could say, oh, he was back in the 20s and they didn't do this kind of thing. But actually, I've written a number of historical novels, and they knew about CPR and, rescue breaths and all that kind of stuff as far back as the 1700s. So this is not some sort of a wild new thing, which we might from modern times read this and say, oh, wow, he was being really prescient and figuring these sorts of things out. No, they knew these sorts of things. And granted, it wasn't widespread where like the entire world knew about CPR and rescue breaths, but it wasn't unknown. This was something that doctors and researchers knew about. And Lovecraft was doing research into these sorts of topics, and he would have known about it. So it's a little anachronistic for him to be saying, oh, we couldn't possibly know if something died, how to get it to start back up again. But what his point is that he wants to give chemical action to be able to give chemicals to a creature and just have the chemicals do it. So that's like the key part here. Something dies and we don't go thumping at its heart and we don't go breathing breath into it. We just inject a chemical and it pops back to life again. So you could say that is interesting, but it's not as groundbreaking as some of the other reviewers that I am reading about think that this is. So Herbert West thinks that it's a great idea to go injecting chemicals, and he wants to start practicing on humans because he thinks that this would be interesting. It's not even phrased like I could save people who were maimed or hurt or anything like that. He just seems to think that it would be a fun thing to do. If someone dies, to be able to pop them back to life again. And the local staff at the medical school thinks this is absolutely horrific and doesn't want him to do any experiments at all. Which, makes sense. It's just, he's a college kid, and this college kid wants to go injecting things into dead people, and they don't want to have anything to do with it. So they talk about how these two college kids are, probably out there getting drunk at night and talking about all these things about the soul and decomposition and how this could be a life-changing kind of thing to figure out. And they decide that they've got to get their hands on some fresh human bodies, because part of the problem is if you have a body that's, 2 weeks old, clearly it's decayed, and even if you had a perfect chemical solution that you can inject into it, that the decayed body is just not going to come back properly. So how are they going to get their hands on freshly dead human bodies? And it says, whenever the morgue provided inadequate, 2 local Negroes attended this matter, and they were seldom questioned. So, of course, it has to be Negroes that are out there scavenging for fresh dead bodies. And this is where we get into the description of West, which they play over and over again in the subsequent ones as part of the recaps, because apparently, even though we never hear what the narrator is like, it's really important what West looks like. And he's a small, slender, spectacled youth with delicate features, yellow hair, pale blue eyes, and a soft voice. So Lovecraft is convinced that it is really strange that this blonde, blue-eyed, small, spectacled youth with delicate features is involved in Frankenstein kind of activities. I'm curious, Kitty, what in the world are you doing? I am curious what kind of person he thinks would be involved in reanimating dead bodies. I mean, should it be some sort of a strong, virile, dark-haired, tall, handsome guy that's reanimating dead bodies? Or should it be some elderly, grizzled guy? He seems very keen on repeating that is a blonde, blue-eyed, and we also have to remember that this is before, clearly, the Nazis and all of that, because this is before or during World War I. And he's almost seeming to describe a Nazi kind of person doing all sorts of horrific experiments. And it's not that, but he is going for the soft view of a man and saying that this is a strange kind of person to expect to be doing experiments on bodies. So I am curious about that as well, why he would think that this would be the wrong or unusual kind of person to be able to do this kind of experiment, that it should be someone I guess he would feel would be more masculine, more rugged, who would be able to attempt these kinds of activities. So they're looking for human bodies. The narrator is an active and enthralled assistant, and they decide that they're going to set up a lab in the Chapman farmhouse, which is abandoned, so that they can do whatever they want to. They scavenge all sorts of equipment there, and they decide that there's a nearby cemetery where they put unembalmed bodies, because you don't want the bodies embalmed if you're going to be doing these kinds of things to it. And this will be a perfect place to go hunting for freshly buried bodies, and then be able to try to stick chemicals in them and see if you could wake them back up again after they have passed. So they've got it all set up. They don't have an incinerator because it's too costly to get an incinerator, but this is the 20s and 30s. You could just bury them in the ground and that's quite fine. And they're following the newspapers to find out when bodies die. And they want one that has all its organs present so that they can try to reanimate it properly. It says accident victims were our best hope. I don't know if I would say that. I would think an accident victim, having read a number of reports, again, from my historic novels, accident victims could have been in really awful shape. I mean, they had some pretty nasty farm equipment and so on back then. That wouldn't be something that you would want to reanimate. I would think that you would want to reanimate people who had passed away peacefully from old age or any number of other kinds of situations. But they went for accident victims, and they found in an almost ideal case a brawny young workman who had drowned and who had not been embalmed. So they decide brawny young workman is great. He drowned. Maybe he just has some water in the lungs, but he doesn't have, kidney damage or liver damage or all that other kind of stuff. So Lovecraft leans into the descriptions that are supposed to make you unsettled. It's a repulsive task that we undertook in the black small hours. And we lacked at that time the special horror of graveyards, which later experiences brought to us. You would think that later experiences would have made them more and more comfortable with graveyards, because it would just be somewhere that they went to harvest their goods. They got spades, so on. They go digging down. It says the process of unearthing was slow and sordid. Might have been gruesomely poetical if it had been artists instead of scientists. So they're just leaning into the, oh, this is really icky, even though he says that it gets ickier as he goes forward in his world. They hauled the contents out of the grave, and then they reburied everything. And then the stiff form and vacant face of a trophy. And then they put the specimen in the canvas sack and then brought it off to the place where they set up the laboratory. He takes efforts to not call it an actual person, to just call it a thing. So they get to the dissecting table, and they say the specimen was not very spectral looking. A sturdy and apparently unimaginative youth of wholesome plebeian type, large-framed, gray-eyed, and brown-haired, a sound animal without psychological subtleties, and probably having vital processes of the simplest and healthiest sort. So clearly, these two intellectual doctors are thinking, oh, this stupid, luggy person who drowned is obviously not really going to have much of a brain, but we'll just try to get it to wake up and grunt or something. Looked half asleep than dead. So they got an ideal dead man, and they're deciding that they're going to try to reanimate it. So they pour chemicals into the guy's body. The waiting was gruesome, but West never faltered. You think gruesome, but really it means nothing. The waiting is just sitting there looking at a dead body who is being dead. And then they sit there for 3/4 of an hour without the least sign of life. So is that really gruesome? I don't think so. It's just sort of boring because you're waiting for something to happen and nothing at all is happening. And they decide that they're going to change the formula and try putting some more into this before they try to bury it again, because they don't want to leave it just lying around and someone might get questions about why they have dead bodies in their empty farmhouse. So The awful event was very sudden and wholly unexpected. So they're sitting there still working on their new version of the chemicals, and then all of a sudden they hear an appalling and demonic succession of cries that either of us had ever heard. The not more unutterable could have been the chaos of hellish sound if the pit itself had opened to release the agony of the damned. For in one inconceivable cacophony was centered all of the supernal terror and unnatural despair of animate nature. Jeez Louise. So he's leading into descriptive words here. So anyway, they're making the chemicals to try to put another set of formula into the dead body when all of a sudden they hear cries. They figure it can't possibly be human, even though they had a dead body in there that they just injected with a whole bunch of stuff. So they go running out the window, running down the street, and then eventually get their ways back to West's bedroom. And they stayed up until dawn. And they sat there and talked to each other and said, okay, it must have just been a wild animal, which, makes no sense at all. But yes, here we're working with the dead body that we just injected with a bunch of chemicals. But it must have been a wild animal that got in there. But then mysteriously the house that they'd been in burned into an amorphous heap of ashes. And then also there had been an attempt to disturb the grave in Potterfield. And they figured, it couldn't possibly be anything. It couldn't be related. So there's a bunch of silliness in here. You would think they would at least exercise their minds a little and decide that it could have been this creature that they were reanimating, and that would be why they heard all these cries from the other room, and that could be why the grave that they dug the guy up from was all disturbed. And for 17 years after that, West would look frequently over his shoulder and complain of fancied footsteps behind him. Now he has disappeared. And that's where we end the first chapter. Lovecraft was told by the editor that he needed to end each one on a cliffhanger to get people to keep reading the series, which is a pretty normal part of writing series for magazines. I don't know if that is anything of a cliffhanger, because we already heard at the beginning that he's disappeared, and we've just heard again that 17 years later he's disappeared. And I mean, it's 17 years later, so what is our cliffhanger? After 17 years, the dead body has finally tracked him down and killed him. It really doesn't feel like much of a cliffhanger to me. But that is what we get for the cliffhanger. So, compared to Frankenstein, I suppose this guy seems pretty emotionless and not caring, and he's just doing this on a lark. He's played with hamsters and gerbils and mice and rats, and now he wants to try it with humans, and he's not doing it because he wants to, save people from cancer or save people from dementia. There's not any sense that there's any sort of wider vision of the world. He's just doing it because it seems like a fun challenge, and wouldn't it be cool if I could take a dead body and make it live again? Which, would be interesting, but it'd be nice if there was some sort of insight about it. And also, all the people around him are saying, this is not something you should just take this lightly. And they already let him work on monkeys and other kinds of creatures. So you would think that there would be some sort of thought in here about, you worked with monkeys, and what have you shown? Let's see some sort of progress in here. But it doesn't seem like they even care. They're like, all right, you did things to monkeys and we don't care, and you did things to dogs and we don't care, but we don't want you to work on humans because we don't know what you're doing. And it doesn't seem like they even cared to figure out what he was doing. So you can say that his point of view is, these old fuddy-duddies in the school don't care about this miraculous work that I'm working on. But it also doesn't seem like he actually did it with any sort of scientific method and came to them and said, look, I've been able to reanimate 200 dogs, and now they are all doing better. And wouldn't this be a great thing if we could help people who had some sort of a drowning incident or something where they were okay and they just had, we'll say, a temporary hiccup in life, and we can get them back on the path to life again. And they might have listened to something like that. So he presents it poorly, the main character, not the narrator, but West. If West presented it well and said, this is what I'm working on, and this is what I've achieved so far, and this is what I want to do next, then they might have cared. And if the narrator had stepped up and done that for his friend, then they might have cared. But He really just seems to say, I've killed a whole bunch of cats and dogs and monkeys, and now I want to start working on humans. And the team around him says, no, you can't work on humans. But you would think at this point that they would say, you can't work in our school anymore because we don't trust your ethics. And what are you even doing? So lots of questionable things in here. But Lovecraft isn't trying to write a treatise on healthy scientific behavior or healthy doctor behavior. He's just trying to write a Frankenstein kind of story. So far, I have some issues with the drowned guy was a stupid normal plebeian, and it's okay if we, mutilate his body because it doesn't really matter because he was just some sort of a brute anyway. But so far it has not descended into the full depths of his racism, which is going to come later on. What would I think about this if I read this as his first story? I actually wouldn't be that keen on reading the next one because Lovecraft has already said, let me scroll up a little. He said that this was, I'll see where we say it. He says that this first horrible incident was the greatest shock I ever experienced, and it's only with reluctance that I repeat it. So he's already telling us that this right here is the worst thing that's going to happen, and the rest of it's just going to get milder since then. Why would it be exciting to me to keep reading if I've already read the worst thing, which is that they tried to reanimate someone and it failed and something ran screaming out and they woke up the next morning and the house was burned down? And then he says, all right, everything's going to be much more mild after this. It doesn't seem like something that is going to set the stage. Normally when you write a story, you write with the calmer thing first, and then you build up to what is going to be the worst possible thing. And we don't know anything at all about the narrator. And the main character seems pretty jerky. He just seems like this blonde, blue-eyed guy that wants to do whatever he wants to do. He wants to kill lots of cats and dogs and monkeys. And now he wants to work on humans. And he is pretty mindless about what happens with all the things that he's doing. So it doesn't draw me into wanting to read more, even as much as I enjoy Frankenstein and other stories like that. But I, of course, will read more. Now, again, part of the process of this is thinking about this first one. It may be on more pondering, the first one becomes more intriguing and you really want to know what happens next. But I watch a lot of serial TV shows and I read a lot of serial stories. And this one doesn't grab me to want to learn what happens next. So in that sense, I think that Lovecraft has not achieved his objective. So let me know your thoughts on this, and I will move on to the next story.